Thanks for listening to Limelight Arts Travels series, Music Matters. In each episode, we'll be talking to one of Limelight's experts about composers, musicians, music history, and performances. In this episode, Limelight Arts Travels' Nick Gordon speaks with music educator and conductor Royna McNamara about Verdi's Requiem.
So thank you, Royna, for coming in to talk to us about Verdi's Requiem. So as a place to start, what was the genesis of this work?
Well, it was quite complicated in a way. Initially, this work was inspired by the death of Rossini. Verdi considered Rossini one of the two greatest Italian artists of his time. And 4 days after his death, Verdi wrote to his publisher, Ricordi, to propose a Requiem Mass to be given in his honour. Each of the 12 sections of the Mass, each one was to be written by a different Italian composer, and Verdi himself would supply the final section. The score was actually to be sealed in the city archives and presented only on subsequent anniversaries. However, the performance never materialised. The organising committee was disbanded. Verdi refused to allow publication or performance of his portion, and in 1873 his score was returned. Verdi's other idol was author Alessandro Manzoni, and Italian Romanticism triumphed with his novel The Betrothed. This work encompassed and accommodated religious ethics and national aspirations. Now, as a teenager, Verdi read the book and came to view it as serving two complementary and ideal uses of art for social ends. He believed not only did it transcend politics to rally people by appealing to their collective roots, but that its popularity attracted the world's attention and admiration. It was actually Verdi's wife, Giuseppina, who first met Manzoni, and she was in raptures about the man. She was moved to tears, saying, "To have seen him, to have spoken to him, and touched the hand of that saint will remain indelible in my heart and mind." So thereafter, she set about creating a meeting between the author and the composer. And in 1868, Verdi finally met Manzoni. He died at a very good age, 89 years of age, and although his death was hardly unexpected, Verdi was deeply grieved, and the next day he wrote to Ricordi saying, "I will come in a little while to visit his tomb alone, and perhaps after further meditation to suggest something to honour his memory." His proposal was to write the entire Mass himself if Milan would fund its first performance. Despite the opposition from the city council, which already had funded a lavish funeral, the mayor finally accepted, and the San Marco church was selected for its excellent acoustics. There were a few conventions broken when this Requiem was written, and that's not surprising if you understand Verdi. Firstly, the convention of using a priest to recite liturgy between musical numbers was bypassed. And in addition, the Archbishop gave special permission to use female performers on the condition that they be veiled, dressed in black, and hidden behind a grating. Now, we must keep in mind, whilst Verdi composed the Libero Me in 1868 to honour Rossini, it was not until 1874, 6 years later, that he composed the entire Requiem, this time to honour Manzoni. Verdi's project was officially titled Requiem Mass for the anniversary of Manzoni's death, May 22nd, 1874.
Well, that is quite a mouthful for a full title. How closely related was the final work from that initial composition in 1868, or is that unknown?
No, the last movement, the Libero Me that Verdi had written for Rossini, he adhered to it pretty closely, actually. And he really changed the textures a little darker, the sonorities were a little different, and the universality of the chorus was moved a little aside, and the soprano's voice was probably featured more. But pretty well he had adhered to that final movement.
Yeah. And in that respect, and I suppose it kind of is that part of that debate about the work is whether it's a requiem, or whether the requiem is a religious or an operatic work, and perhaps some of those slight changes in the sonority might play to that.
Yes, it's an ongoing debate, and I really think to understand his music, we must understand the man. And Verdi himself said, "My nature rebels against conformity." And the Requiem is a superb example of how Verdi shunned conformity. All his great operatic scenes are virtually crystallized and perfected in his Requiem, where what we are given is an inescapable drama of death. And to expect Verdi to produce anything like ecclesiastical music would be a mistake. He was not a religious man. But I imagine to 19th century Catholic ears, accustomed to the cool polyphonies of Palestrina, Verdi's musical account of the Mass must have been quite disturbing, actually. Verdi's score is intensely melodic, but bristles with surging passion and challenging discomfort. And the resulting work was probably indeed as dramatic as any Verdi opera. Its juxtaposition of solo voices and chorus, extreme sensitivity to the text, and outright drama could, in fact, mark it as operatic. And indeed, interestingly, Verdi cast two artists who had performed the leads in his Aida 4 years earlier in the roles. And the soprano was Teresa Stoltz. She is an interesting person in Verdi's life. They had an ongoing affair for many, many years. So interesting choice. And then the mezzo-soprano was Maria Waldman. But Verdi never intended his work to be sung as part of a church service, so it actually gave him more freedom to select and emphasize different portions that ran the gamut, really, of human experience. And because he was a man of theatre, Verdi chose to fashion those disparate elements into a drama rather than a staid presentation of liturgical dogma, really. And it really is ironic that from this simple man who had no pretensions of philosophical insight, he would say that over and over again, "I'm a simple man and I don't pretend to be more than that." But there arose a work that presents far more sophisticated approach in a way to theology than his predecessors. But I guess for me, the question is not really whether it's religious or operatic, but rather why we still continue to debate it. Because Verdi said quite clearly, the Requiem is simply a tribute of respectful affection, the expression of my sorrow to the great one whom I so admired as a writer and as a model for patriotism. So whether it be religious or operatic, I think is totally irrelevant. And I'm sure Verdi was not thinking about these things when he was composing the Requiem. He simply wanted his work to complement Manzoni's own achievement as a proud emissary for displaying Italian culture to the world.
And that kind of, I think that makes a lot of sense of it for us, so thank you. I wonder, though, is there still, it might seem sometimes, though, like an odd choice for a man who's not religious to choose a mass rather than perhaps a more secular form, like an oratio to honour his heroes.
Mm. It's been suggested that there were both historical and practical motivations for writing a mass. Some suggested, why didn't he use the words of Manzoni as text, and that would have allowed him to write for an oratorio. But the Mass had been used by Cherubini and Rossini to honour departed public figures, and thus probably a work in that genre was more likely to be welcomed. Besides, we have to remember Verdi had a large emotional investment in his contribution to the aborted Rossini venture. So he could continue using that work, which he had a passion for, by writing the Mass. And some think, perhaps on a personal level, that Verdi found an outlet in the varied text of the Requiem to explore his own ambivalent faith through his sense of drama.
Which is a fairly magnificent kind of a way to do that, to explore ambivalence through something that he obviously has a very strong feeling about.
Yes, and his wife often ridiculed him due to his lack of faith, actually. So that doesn't say he was a fine, upstanding man, but
yes. Oh. So how did Verdi feel about the legacy that this work would have? Did he have any idea that it would become to be such an historic work, or did he think it would change the way we understand music in any way, or that could it enlighten us at all?
I think Verdi himself, his intention was that the focus would be on honouring Manzoni. That was his ultimate focus. However, in fact, it's always the music that has reigned supreme throughout history. Even before its first performance, it was controversial in far as the music. Critics were divided between praise and condemnation with respect to Verdi's willingness to break standard compositional rules just for musical effect. They were in consensus about the quality of the music. They agreed the work displayed fluid invention, beautiful sound effects, and charming vocal writing. It's interesting, some have likened the Requiem to Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which has also been rebuked for raw emotion. And both works place far greater emphasis on terror than comfort. And some of the sections in the Mass that would provide you with that comfort were not used in the same way in this Requiem at all. Regardless of what the critics were saying, the premiere in the San Marco Church, conducted by Verdi, was such a success that 3 performances were held at La Scala following that. And a review of the performances in La Scala were all wonderful, saying that every movement was applauded with rapture. And I guess if the Mass returned to La Scala, it allowed the audience to have they were unrestrained by those ecclesiastical conventions and were able to give vent to their enthusiasm in, it's all typically Italian exuberance, I guess. It was acclaimed as a masterpiece all over Catholic Europe, but in England was a different story. The new Royal Albert Hall was not filled, and Verdi left London in disgust, actually. But I think if we know the person who knows him best, his wife, probably had the greatest insight into the significance of the work, because she saw it and said that posterity will place it in domination of all the music ever conceived by the human brain. Now, she was probably a little biased, but she could see the significance of the work. But I think nowadays, Manzoni is barely remembered. And as we spoke in the earlier, I pointed out that long, lengthy title. Well, today we just refer to it as Verdi's Requiem. Manzoni's not even in the title. But the fresh, direct radiance and power of the music has still endured. So I often wonder, would Verdi be happy with that? Because it was so important to him to honour Manzoni. His name's out of the title, and it's always the music that is the discussion point.
And certainly outside of Italy, Verdi is infinitely better known than Manzoni as well today.
It's interesting, isn't it? So he may have been a little disappointed in some respects to see that happen.
Yes, to have eclipsed the artist he wanted to honour so much. So it's often said that Verdi's art is an art of juxtaposition and jagged contrasts. Just thinking of the music itself, how is this manifest in the Requiem?
Well, the entire Requiem displays his distinctive style of contrasts and mood changes. And, you know, if I had 2 hours, I could go through each movement and explain that. But I do think the final movement, the Libera Me, serves as a culmination of the entire work, and it provides a summation and emotional core to the work. And I think in the final movement, Verdi delivered a deeply personal message. And we said earlier that it did align fairly closely to the Rossini version. But the structure of the Libera Me is of these disconcerting clashes of style and succession of moods that dispels any comfort the text might suggest. It begins in this lovely, naive, pure faith of hushed, monotone Gregorian chant. And then immediately it's challenged by the fear of the soprano's premonition of the day of reckoning. And then tranquility is shattered once more by the uproar of the Desiree. And that really is an uproar and a hitting of all our senses. And then we return to what initially was a very tranquil movement earlier in the work, the Requiem Aeterna. But this time that tranquility is not evident, and it's also full of turmoil. And if we work through to the final climax, it really is a section that virtually exhausts the chorus. And the soprano offers a line of chant in a sort of a conversational tone, and it's marked on the score senza misura, without strict time, and to be performed as softly as possible, quadruple P, which is barely audible really for a vocalist. And it's at the bottom of her soprano range, middle C, which is difficult to do. And she's drained of feeling, and on the score it specifically says morendo, which is dying. And she has final breaths, and she just manages to sing 2 pleas of Libera Me, Libera Me. And she's left to confront the worst fear of all for a culture steeped in faith. And it's that at the end of life's struggles, there is no salvation at all, but only eternal silence. And how Verdi captures that eternal silence is very, very powerful. And so the Requiem ends in a gesture that's sort of musically and philosophically both thoroughly modern in its theology, really, but it's utterly devastating in its emotional impact.
And I imagine as well the ability to end with a silence is sort of
powerful.
Yes.
After being bombarded, particularly by the Desiree and other sections, yes. Yeah, so his distinct style, and it's not only in the Requiem, he does it earlier, obviously, but I think it's magnified in each movement in this work.
Yeah. And just thinking about that final section with Senza Misura, has that been something that has been interpreted differently by different ensembles?
It's interesting. The length of the recordings, it's so popular. There's over 135 recordings. And Verdi said himself, I don't want some conductors to take leniency and drag everything out and over-exaggerate these things. But the time limit between certain conductors varies as much as 15 to 20 minutes,
wow, which
is quite significant.
that's a huge, huge. Wow. Okay. And just finally, I'm interested to know if you're a fan of Verdi more generally. Obviously, your enthusiasm and your love of his work is coming through. But is it just about the Requiem for you, or is it more about his entire oeuvre?
No. I love Verdi. I'm fascinated by his development as a dramatist and how he broke down the traditional forms of Italian opera. He believed in artistic integrity. He refused money at times to when people asked him to change the score, or he refused that. So, and drama, he believed drama and was inextricably linked to the music itself. He writes beautifully for singers, and though he pushes them to their technical summit, he always displays a great understanding and insight and never employs virtuosity for its own sake. There's a reason behind why he pushes the singers. But if you marry this with his fine orchestral writing, where every note has a precise dramatic function and it propels the drama forward without jeopardizing the lyric drama and overpowering the vocal line, I think you therefore have the complete composer, someone that's aware of the vocal and of the orchestral and marries them beautifully. And I think in many ways, Verdi's greatness is a really simple thing. He found a way of speaking to all people.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for talking to us about Verdi today, Royna. And I think it's a wonderful democratic message coming through in his work, the way you've brought it out today, which is so fitting both to his times, to himself, but also to Manzoni, who he was honouring with the Requiem.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travel Series, Music Matters. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.